Hey guys, tonight we step into the dew-damp execution grounds at the Tower of London, where the morning mist curls around cold stone walls and the French executioner's sword glints under the pale sun. Picture Anne Boleyn in her grey and red gown, her head held high in that decisive moment, while Henry VIII waits aboard his royal barge for the cannon fire that signals her last breath, becoming a blood-stained stroke in the annals of history. And trust me, you won't survive as we recount every detail of her proud final prayer and that merciless blade. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment below to let me know where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. On a misty May morning in 1536, the Tower of London lay in a suffocating stillness, pale shafts of sunlight piercing through cracks in the stone, painting cold streaks on the hard walls. Inside the cramped chamber, Anne Boleyn, who had once worn the crown of Queen of England, sat against the stone wall, her heart fluttering between anxiety and pride. Her name, which had once echoed through the royal court, was now but a fading echo in the night, awaiting a verdict of life or death. The story of Anne Boleyn was not merely a historical judgment, but a dramatic tragedy of the Tudor era, where power and fate clashed without mercy. Anne Boleyn was born around 1501 at Blickling Hall in Norfolk, into the rising Boleyn family. Her father, Sir Thomas Boleyn, was a seasoned diplomat who had served as England's ambassador to France and the Netherlands. Her mother, Lady Elizabeth Howard, came from the prestigious Howard lineage as the daughter of the Duke of Norfolk. From childhood, Anne Boleyn inherited the sharp political vision of the Howards and the diplomatic acumen of the Boleyns. Her parents expected their daughter to become a person of influence and invested in her elite education from an early age. In her youth, Anne Boleyn was sent to France to serve as a lady-in-waiting at the court of King Francois, where she encountered the humanist currents of the Renaissance. There she mastered French, studied poetry, philosophy, and scripture, and mingled with Europe's leading thinkers and artists. That progressive environment forged her into an intelligent, confident woman with an extraordinary air of allure. Upon her return to England, Anne Boleyn's extensive knowledge and refined manner of dress caught the court's attention, and she quickly became the centre of every royal gathering. Among those captivated by Anne Boleyn's unique presence, none was so impressed as King Henry VIII. At that time, King Henry VIII was still married to Princess Catherine of Aragon, yet his heart had been ensnared by this remarkable woman. The relationship between Anne Boleyn and King Henry VIII was not purely romantic, but carried profound political implications. To marry Anne Boleyn, King Henry VIII defied every precedent of the Catholic Church by divorcing Catherine, a never-before-seen action, and proceeded to break from Rome, establishing the Church of England with himself as its supreme head. According to historian Hilary Mantel, no one survives at the Tudor court without understanding the rules of the game of power. Anne Boleyn, with her political savvy and self-belief, once dreamed of rewriting those rules, yet it was precisely that ambition and confidence that made her a target for covert attacks. The conservatives within the court swiftly recognized her as a threat and began plotting to destroy the woman who had once been King Henry VIII's hope. Now, amid the veil of mist, Anne Boleyn prepared to face her final tragedy, a tragedy not only hers, but that of England itself, where power could turn life into death with a single merciless stroke of the sword. Anne Boleyn was not merely a figure in the spectacular love affair with King Henry VIII, but the spark that ignited the English Reformation. Their first meeting was hardly a whirlwind romance, but a courtly intrigue. Anne Boleyn, then only a mid-rank lady-in-waiting, was chosen to serve Princess Mary, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, on her visit to France. In Paris, She quickly impressed with her confident bearing, refined taste, and extensive knowledge of Renaissance culture. It was at a lavish feast in Fontainebleau that Anne Boleyn's sharp gaze and artful smile captivated King Henry VIII, who was seeking an extraordinary figure to refresh the political stage, and he could not look away. Returning to England, Anne Boleyn maintained her irresistible allure, though still a lady in waiting. She outshone even the nobles at court with her quick wit and deft conversational skills. King Henry VIII was gradually drawn into the psychological and political game she devised. She proposed bold ideas for church reform, championing the monarch's autonomy even over the Pope. When Catherine of Aragon steadfastly refused the king's demands, King Henry VIII realized that only Anne Boleyn was worthy to become his new queen and to stand by him in his confrontation with Vatican authority. The decision to marry Anne Boleyn marked an unprecedented turning point in English history. King Henry VIII resolutely divorced Catherine, defying the condemnation of the Roman Church. This act not only freed him from religious constraint, but also led to the establishment of the Church of England, with himself as its supreme head. In the splendour of Westminster Palace, Anne Boleyn's coronation unfolded beneath a glittering jewelled crown, with trumpets resounding and oaths of loyalty filling the air. From a humble lady-in-waiting, she suddenly ascended the throne, becoming queen of a mighty kingdom. That royal joy was soon rewarded by the birth of Princess Elizabeth. In 1533, the much-awaited male heir still did not appear, but Anne Boleyn skillfully used her influence and authority to secure her daughter's position in a harshly patriarchal society. She convened scholars and progressive theologians to spread ideas of equality and individual worth. Despite whispers among the conservative courtiers, Elizabeth Future, Queen Elizabeth I, grew up amid spirited debate, exposed to a court brimming with ambition and reform. Yet the turbulent marriage began to reveal a fatal flaw. Anne Boleyn could not produce a male heir. This became an unpardonable crime in the eyes of King Henry VIII and his deep-rooted courtiers. The pressure of succession weighed heavily, as the Tudor dynasty needed a son to secure the throne against European rivals. Every time Anne Boleyn endured the pains of childbirth, only to welcome another daughter's cry, it stabbed at King Henry VIII's ambitions and expectations. Moreover, Jane Seymour, a gentle, modest lady-in-waiting, was introduced to the king in 1536. Her quiet demeanour and lack of political turbulence quickly won King Henry VIII's favour, as he craved a less complicated and scandal-free relationship. As Henry turned his tender attentions to Jane, Anne Boleyn's power, once grounded in political alliance and romantic devotion, weakened. Behind the scenes, Thomas Cromwell, King Henry VIII's powerful right hand, saw the writing on the wall for Anne Boleyn's queenship. Cromwell had once collaborated closely with Anne Boleyn on reform efforts, but when political interests collided, he was ready to betray her. He plotted to spread lewd accusations, alleging Anne Boleyn had committed adultery with multiple courtiers, even her brother Sir George Boleyn. These charges, though unsupported by credible evidence, were enough to condemn a woman in a male-dominated society and under a king who had grown disenchanted. By May 15, Etienne Wu by Saint-Chelot, Anne Boleyn was brought before a court of men, King Henry VIII's most trusted officials. Within minutes of sentencing, the death verdict was declared without mention of the execution method. According to contemporary law, a queen convicted of serious crimes would normally be burned at the stake. But King Henry VIII's mercy manifested in ordering a French sword considered more refined than the axe. Meanwhile, the hidden sword had already been transported from Calais to London before the verdict was proclaimed, proving that the death sentence was predetermined even before Anne Boleyn entered the courtroom. From a humble lady-in-waiting to a powerful queen, only to tumble in a ruthless machine of power. Anne Boleyn's life encapsulated the Tudor era's tragic highs and lows, where a single misstep in the rules of the game could cost not only one's life but also a dynasty's honour. Following the anguish of her unjust trial, Anne Boleyn's final days were spent suffocating within the walls of the Tower of London as she awaited the day of her beheading. After her death sentence was pronounced, she was moved from the Queen's Jail to the Bell Tower, a damp, dimly lit chamber, infamous for its cramped cells and flickering candlelight. Her cell measured only a few square meters, its stone walls perpetually cold, furnished with nothing more than an old wooden bed, draped in coarse linen, and a tiny table holding a water jug and a few stale biscuits. The air grew heavier by the hour. The only sounds came from the wind whipping through the wall cracks and the distant echo of guards' footsteps. Each day, jailers delivered meagre rations, thin barley porridge, a piece of soggy black bread, and water from boiled bones, with a few scraps of cheap greens. Occasionally, a former lady-in-waiting, once her attendant, before she became queen, secretly smuggled in a cup of warm milk or dried fruit to ease her hunger. Anne always drank plain water, boiled and left to cool. On one occasion, she even refused a pear sent into her cell, remarking that she did not need luxuries on the eve of her final hours. During this time, Anne Boleyn had no chance to see her 3-year-old daughter, Elizabeth. The court feared every meeting might be exploited by the Queen's enemies to justify harsher charges. Elizabeth lived on a strict guard at Hampton Court, tended by her governess and attendants. Whenever someone spoke her name, Anne's eyes would well with longing, but all she could do was scatter her maternal love into hurried scraps of writing. Each word carefully chosen, King Henry VIII never visited her. Despite their shared history of religious upheaval and royal splendor, rumor within the palace whispered that he was too busy preparing to wed Jane Seymour, rather than granting his former queen a final farewell. His silence cut Anne to the core. Once his closest companion, she was now his enemy. To be expunged from the realm, the court buzzed with scandal, but Anne remained alone in darkness, wondering whether the love that once bound them could ever have saved her. Her spirits oscillated between hope and despair. By candlelight each night, she would kneel before a small altar in her cell's corner, praying for her soul's peace and for her daughter's safety. She recited scripture slowly, fingers tightening around her wooden rosary as though clinging to faith itself. Many nights she lay awake, staring through the narrow window at the dark sky, imagining cradling Elizabeth in her arms, only to be reminded by the wind's chilling howl that her final encounter would be with fate, not family. By the dim glow, Anne drafted several hastily written letters to her parents and closest friends. In her letter to Sir Thomas and Lady Elizabeth Boleyn, she begged them to protect Elizabeth, to give her the education and life befitting a princess. She made no self-serving requests, only lamented that she had failed in her highest duty as a royal mother. In a note to her trusted former attendant, she urged her to safeguard news of Elizabeth's health from the king's agents, so that no further harm would come to the child. These fragile papers, tied with a length of woolen thread, constituted the last legacy she could leave for the future. Anne wrote no grand will. Her assets were at the mercy of the crown, but her final words to Elizabeth carried the weight of a mother's love. "My dearest child, I know that I will never leave your heart. Live bravely and kindly, as your mother always believed you could." Ink smudged by tears retained the power of her undying devotion. In her last days, she was moved to a smaller cell within the main tower. Once the very hall where her coronation feast had resounded, now only remnants of that past grandeur remained. A torn velvet curtain, a faded fragment of tapestry, and a tarnished silver mirror, each time she gazed upon the peeling paint and frayed fabric. Anne recalled the day she first entered those halls as the symbol of reform, not as a doomed prisoner, no longer queen. She was simply a solitary woman facing a cruel fate. She penned her final diary entries, recalling her first meeting with Henry in France, the sparkle in his eyes when she spoke of church reform, the laughter they shared as she outlined a vision for an independent England. Those memories, now etched indelibly in her heart, were meant to show Elizabeth that her mother had lived and fought for a brighter future. On the dawn before her execution, Anne awoke earlier than usual. A guard brought her a bowl of hot porridge and a crust of bread, but she nibbled only a few spoonfuls, brushing aside the former attendant's plea. "You'll need your strength for the final battle." Anne only smiled faintly and replied, "My body is but flesh. My spirit remains unbowed." Aye, in that quiet moment, she folded her hands in prayer and looked once more at the bare window frame. The footsteps of the guards drew nearer. The moment of reckoning had arrived. Her eyes shone with defiant grace. Though her body would vanish, her soul would soar on, joining the legacy of those who dared to challenge power and champion justice. Then, in a whisper meant only for herself, she confided, "My child, I love you." A darkness fell over the cell, concluding the final chapter in the life of a queen whose story would echo through the ages, continuing the chain of anguish and silence at the Tower of London. The events outside the stone walls also reflected King Henry VIII's tumultuous state of mind. He who had shattered church law for his love of Anne Boleyn, divorced Catherine of Aragon, and founded the Church of England. Now he stood on the threshold of a momentous decision, to punish the wife who had shared so many highs and lows with him. King Henry VIII was not a heartless tyrant. In rare private moments, he was haunted by memories of Anne Boleyn's radiant smile and bright eyes. The image of the woman who once made his heart beat wildly kept spinning through his mind. He wondered, when he ordered her execution, was he punishing a criminal, or losing forever the partner who had shared his hopes for reform and defiance of papal authority? Aboard his royal barge gliding on the River Thames, with salter-tinged breeze and the lap of waves against the hull, King Henry VIII gazed silently toward the Tower of London, where the French sword awaited. Torn thoughts assailed him, relief that he would no longer be hampered by his wife's political machinations, and sorrow for a love so dramatic that it had upended an entire kingdom. Rumour held that he secretly penned a letter to be delivered to her cell, saying, "Through all these years, the mother of my child gave me days of happiness. Though I know I shall forever regret this, that letter, if it ever existed, was never confirmed." The choice of sword over axe was no random detail. Under custom, the crude axe served for commoners, the sword quicker, more precise, was a courtesy reserved for knights and high nobility. In this final act, King Henry VIII intended to show his mercy, a swift, less painful death befitting her royal status. Deep down, it was also his way of affirming that, despite his anger, his former queen still deserved to be treated with princely dignity. Yet was this pardon born of genuine affection, or merely a political spectacle? The latter seems more plausible. King Henry VIII needed to preserve the prestige of his throne and the shaky new church. An execution by sword appeared more merciful to the public, yet retained the awe-inspiring display of royal authority. He could commute the method to something less brutal, but still enforce the harsh sentence. Meanwhile, at Hampton Court, little Princess Elizabeth Anne Boleyn's and Henry VIII's only daughter remained unaware of the tragedy unfolding. At 3 years old, she was far too young to grasp the death sentence looming over her mother, and the court's ladies-in-waiting skillfully concealed all sorrowful news. Each night, Elizabeth was lulled to sleep with the tale that your mother has gone to visit her aunt in a distant land, sparing her tender heart from confusion. Perhaps in her hazy dreams the child once murmured, "Where's Mummy?" But no one dared speak the truth. Legend says Elizabeth clutched her rag doll and whispered, "Please, Father in heaven, bring Mummy back to me." Yet these whispers were never formally recorded. Only the midwives and governesses privately nurtured in her young heart a longing for reunion. In contrast, King Henry VIII received no plea for clemency from his daughter. He was not permitted to see Elizabeth during the final days of this fateful marriage. Their relationship remained estranged. Elizabeth grew up in the care of her governess and ladies-in-waiting, not cradled by her father's love. That absence haunted him. By stripping Anne of her motherhood, he had unwittingly severed his own bond with a girl not yet 4 years old, absent from the Tower of London itself. King Henry VIII chose to stand on his barge's deck, turning his back on the grim scene, concealing his inner turmoil. Inside, he wondered, was he losing forever the sweet wife who had weathered political storms by his side? They say he closed his eyes when the cannon boomed, unwilling to behold the blood spurting from Anne Boleyn's neck. But in that moment, the solemn decree was reaffirmed. Power triumphs over sentiment. King Henry VIII had placed dynastic interests above personal love, wielding the sword to uphold order and strike terror into dissenters. No matter how deeply pained he was, he could not revoke the sentence Tudor England had sealed Anne Boleyn's fate long before. The final echoes of King Henry VIII's state of mind were a tapestry of regret and duty, power and compassion. He chose the harshest path to safeguard his crown. As for little Elizabeth, when she learned the truth, she would carry within her heart the lesson of ruthless authority and unconditional maternal love. Proof that, however often history forsakes, true love never fades. Not yet one. Nil words. But here's the complete translation as requested. And then that day finally came. Early on the morning of May 19th, the Tower of London lay shrouded in a bone-chilling spring mist, each pale shaft of sunlight filtering through gaps in the stone walls and painting ghostly streaks upon the damp ground. Lady Anne Boleyn awoke before dawn broke, in the cramped cell where she had spent her final hours. Around her, nothing but grey stone walls. The only flicker of light came from a simple candle set upon a small altar holding an aged silver cross and a withered bouquet. Before stepping out, she knelt to receive her last Holy Communion, listening to the whispered prayers echo softly in the dungeon's gloom. Each intoned verse lulled her spirit toward tranquility, preparing her for the life war, the Wygar moment ahead. After the solemn rite, Lady Anne Boleyn donned a plain yet deeply symbolic outfit, an outer cloak of ash grey representing historical sorrow and her prisoner's fate, and beneath it a deep crimson robe symbolizing blood, sacrifice, and unshakable loyalty. She gently removed her cap, gathering her hair in a tight knot beneath a small coif, then gripped tightly the wooden rosary beads she had guarded throughout her imprisonment. Each bead held a prayer, a hope, and a fragment of memory from her days of freedom. As she stepped into the corridor, the jailers stood silent, barely daring to breathe, lest they break the final ritual. The populace had been summoned the night before, stirred by news of the historic execution. Soldiers and officials formed two solemn lines, discreet, yet their eyes betraying curiosity and dread. Dawn's light gradually touched their metal breastplates, creating a scene both solemn and suffocating. It was said that Lady Anne Boleyn still smiled as she ascended the stone steps to the scaffold. Tall and graceful, she moved with the poise of a woman who had once stood at the pinnacle of power. Reaching the center of the gathered crowd, she paused, turned to face the silence. Her eyes flashing, resolve. The air seemed to freeze. Even the wind stilled to hear her words. I am not here to accuse anyone. I only ask that you pray for my soul. Hi, those few brief words resonated deeply. Not once did she beg for mercy, for she knew her innocence. That courage was not a final act of weakness, but the last testament of a queen who had dared to challenge the church and devote herself wholly to her king. The decisive moment arrived. With the swift inevitability of gravity, the French sword was raised, its blade glinting in the morning light, making many hearts tremble, bound gently at the wrists to ensure a dignified proceeding. Her head was placed upon the block. The signal horn sounded, and in a single heartbeat the blade fell. All fell silent, except for the final exhalation that lingered upon her lips. Her head rolled back, lips still moving as though completing an unheard prayer. That savage instant closed one life and opened an immortal legacy. 3 loyal ladies-in-waiting, those who had served her from her days as a mere court attendant, bowed their heads and approached with reverent sorrow. They carefully retrieved her body, wrapping it in coarse cloth. Their every movement was imbued with respect and grief. A collective gasp broke from the crowd, soft cries echoing among those who remembered Lady Anne Boleyn's former glory. A wooden chest was placed on a small cart and slowly wheeled away from the square, bearing her remains into a hidden recess of the Tower of London, where she would rest temporarily until the next royal ceremonies could take place. King Henry VIII was not present on the scaffold. He stood on the banks of the Thames, aboard his stately royal barge, his gaze fixed upon the tower. Though he had chosen the merciful method of the sword instead of the axe, he could not escape the pang of sorrow. When the cannon roared signalling Lady Anne Boleyn's death, King Henry VIII closed his eyes, as if rejecting the painful reality. The cannon's thunder did more than mark the end of a life. It etched an eternal regret into his heart. Immediately after the volley, the barge glided away, carrying King Henry VIII back to Whitehall Palace to prepare for the coronation of his third wife, Jane Seymour. That act affirmed his supreme power. Once the verdict was issued, all personal feelings yielded to dynastic duty. King Henry VIII's authority shone in his ability to commute the method of execution to a less painful one. Yet he could not rescind the stern sentence itself. May 19th concluded with the image of 3 devoted ladies-waiting bearing Lady Anne Boleyn's coffin from the square. While mournful whispers drifted through the air, she was the woman who defied the church. She was Elizabeth's mother, the future queen. But regardless of how history records it, that moment stands as an emblem of power, justice, and the harshness of fate. After the chest was placed in its temporary resting place, awaiting the day when Elizabeth would come of age to receive her mother's remains, the tower returned to a hushed stillness. Yet, Lady Anne Boleyn's legacy extended beyond crowns or court intrigues. It lay in the image of a woman who sacrificed for the cause of religious freedom, in a message eternal about dignity and courage. Her story would continue to resonate through generations as proof that, no matter how cruel authority may be, the human spirit endures. Following the tragic death of Lady Anne Boleyn, public discourse never ceased as people grew increasingly curious to uncover the real woman behind the vilified queen. Her identity was far more than that of a beautiful Tudor court consort. She embodied ambition and intellect, a whirlwind that shook the course of English history. She was born around 1500 at Blickling Hall in Norfolk into the ascending noble Boleyn family. In her youth, she was sent to the Netherlands and France to be educated, where she came into direct contact with Renaissance culture, religious thought, and courtly etiquette. Unlike most English women of her time, she spoke fluent French, possessed a modern outlook, and wielded formidable political acumen. It was precisely these qualities that made Anne distinctive and simultaneously dangerous to the conservative factions at court. She was not merely a graceful face among royalty, but a mind thirsty for knowledge and reform. Historian Alison Weir observed, "Anne was not an innocent victim of court conspiracy. She was the first woman daring enough to ensnare a powerful king. Indeed, she accomplished what no mistress before her dared. She captivated Henry VIII, led him to abandon his first wife, and break with the Roman Church to crown her as his queen." The campaign to conquer Henry's heart spanned nearly 7 years, becoming one of the costliest pursuits in English royal history. Throughout that time, Anne refused to be the king's convenient mistress, the quickest route to his favour, and insisted on only one role, queen. This bold stance earned her a reputation for a fiery temper and relentless defence of her own rights. Above all, it cemented her political standing. She would not passively accept her fate, but would write her own rules. Tywyn Anne Boleyn. Henry VIII undertook the unprecedented. Despite the Pope's refusal to annul his first marriage, he resolutely divorced Catherine of Aragon. That divorce shocked Europe. and marked the turning point of the English Reformation. Henry founded the Church of England, declaring himself its supreme head and severing ties with Rome. His boundless love for Anne ignited a flame of religious freedom, but it also planted the seeds of profound conflict. During their 3 years of marriage, Anne bore Princess Elizabeth the future. Queen Elizabeth I yet failed to deliver a male heir, the gravest offence in the eyes of the Tudor court. That deficiency became the deepest crack in their union, leaving Henry disillusioned and the public sceptical. The king's heart, once brimming with hope, now carried disappointment at having only daughters when a son was paramount to secure the throne. Amid this turmoil, Jane Seymour emerged as a new beacon, gentle, unobtrusive, and free from scandal. Jane's arrival underscored the contrast with Anne's passionate drive. While Anne personified the fire of reform, Jane embodied peace and obedience, the qualities Henry ultimately longed for his next queen. That comparison sent his loyalties and emotions into unpredictable turmoil. Into this fraught moment stepped Thomas Cromwell, Henry's powerful chief minister, who seized the opportunity of their discord to gradually estrange the king from Anne. Cromwell understood that the more Anne was perceived as a threat, the more he would solidify his own political influence. He orchestrated a smear campaign of lewd accusations, alleging her adultery with multiple nobles and even her brother George Boleyn, though no credible evidence existed. Such charges sufficed to condemn her in a male-dominated society and under a king who felt betrayed. Anne, confident in her intelligence and tact, once believed she could master the rules of the court, but the deeper she played, the more she was swept into the ruthless whirlpool of politics. This was not merely a personal tragedy, but a political consequence. The price of her pursuit of religious freedom and gender equality, and her challenge to ecclesiastical power. After the conspiracies were exposed, and the May 15th trial delivered its death verdict, Anne Boleyn's image transcended that of victim to become a symbol of power unsettled. People began to re-examine her life from her childhood in France, and the courtly lessons learned there, to her bold attempt to sway Henry with political prowess, to her ascent as queen, her championing of religious reform, and at last her dignified execution without a plea for mercy. Anne's actions left an indelible mark. She was pivotal in shifting England away from Vatican rule. Despite the dangers she faced, the populace began recording her tale in new light, not only as a betrayed consort, but as a heroine who sacrificed for religious conviction and national sovereignty. Scholars, historians, and writers have since hailed Anne as the pioneering woman wielding true political power in a religious revolution. Through the eyes of posterity, Anne no longer remains solely a tragic soul, but a trailblazer for gender equality in English politics. She dared to challenge the church, used theology to empower the king, and became the ire of reactionary factions. That contrast made her role both admirable and poignant. The battle for the crown concluded, yet her status rose above that of a condemned woman. She became the echo of reason and women's rights, an echo only fully understood after she lay dead. Elizabeth, her daughter, would later reign for 44 years, illuminating the dynasty and standing as the final testament to Anne Boleyn's legacy. A woman born not merely to adorn a throne, but to change history. And then, it was Thomas Cromwell himself, once her ally, who deceived the king to remove Anne from the game of power. It was not Jane Seymour, but Thomas Cromwell, the king's chief minister and chancellor of the Exchequer, who truly masterminded the plot to destroy Lady Anne Boleyn. In the beginning, he and the Queen had been close allies in the religious reforms, jointly supporting King Henry VIII's break with Rome to establish the Church of England. Yet when political influence and policy differences erupted into conflict, that alliance quickly collapsed. Cromwell, cunning and far-seeing, seized his moment when the king grew disenchanted over Anne's failure to produce a male heir. He quietly sowed seeds of doubt and arranged a sophisticated campaign to pry her from the throne. First, Cromwell deftly planted suspicion among the senior courtiers. Why had the Queen, the one woman most favoured by the king, failed at the most crucial task of securing the realm's future. Daily gossip sheets began circulating. She was accused of crossing the bounds of decency with several courtiers, even with her own brother, George Boleyn. The whisper spread rapidly from covert murmurs in the ladies' rooms to tampered courtier diaries until every corridor echoed with scandal. In a society that devalued women, and at a moment when the king's goodwill had evaporated, a single sensational accusation was enough to brand her a traitor. Cromwell did not stop there. He escalated the charges to high treason, alleging that the Queen, who had access to secret documents and stores of poison, was plotting to kill the king and usurp the crown. Rumours swept through the court like wildfire. Tudor serving dishes rumoured to be laced. Secret letters, supposedly outlining her scheme. All of these proofs were coerced testimony and forged documents engineered by Cromwell's faction without a shred of genuine verification. But Cromwell understood that once a woman's honour was stained, no one would dare defend her. In a court awash with intrigue, outrage easily drowned out any call for fairness. Before Anne even set foot in the courtroom, her supporters were arrested and executed under similar charges. Robert Weston, Sir Thomas Wyatt. Even moderate clergy were convicted of allying with the Queen against the King's supreme will. These public executions not only purged rival factions, but also provided vivid evidence to legitimize the rebellion charges against Anne. Curious crowds lined the square in solemn silence, while Cromwell watched with a cold smile. Knowing the trap was sprung, on May Shirwu, Etienne Wu by Saint-Chaleu. The trial convened inside the Tower of London. The judges were all men handy-picked by the king, none sympathetic to the Queen's cause. Anne was stripped of her right to defence. No counsel was permitted to speak on her behalf. Every truthful argument, every exculpatory fact was summarily dismissed. The trial rapidly became a theatre of power, with principal roles clear: Cromwell as director, Henry VIII as judge, and Anne Boleyn as the condemned waiting for the final act. In the stifling courtroom air, the rap of the gavel signalled proceedings to begin. Cromwell stood at one corner, his sharp gaze sweeping each judge's face, confident that a single idle accusation and a nod from the bench would seal her fate. Witnesses loyal to Cromwell were called in one by one, describing how the Queen had indulged in licentious acts with various court ladies and even her own brother. These salacious testimonies shattered whatever noble image she once held in the public's eye. When Anne was allowed to speak, she merely looked into her judge's eyes, her forehead damp with sweat, yet her voice steady as she declared all accusations baseless. She pleaded earnestly for permission to present her own defence, but the presiding judge replied coldly, "The court will accept no further evidence." In that moment, truth was officially banished, giving way to politics and personal vendettas. With the death sentence pronounced, Cromwell cast a triumphant glance at Henry, underlining his own supremacy. Though the Queen had led the Reformation and was mother to a royal princess, she would not be spared. In that ruthless society where men held all power, a dramatic accusation was enough to doom any woman. Cromwell knew that the rules of his game must be obeyed absolutely, regardless of real justice. When the trial ended, the judges rose and left Anne in iron bonds, amid the icy gazes of her accomplices. The verdict was merely the prelude to execution. Soon she would be moved to another cell to await the fatal blow. Cromwell emerged the true victor. He had not only eliminated a threat to royal authority, but also consolidated his own near-absolute power. Thomas Cromwell's machinations proved that in the Tudor arena, power needs no legitimacy, only cunning execution. Lady Anne Boleyn, once a political force who challenged the church and rose to become queen, ultimately fell to the schemes of the man she once called ally. That harsh reality revealed that this dynasty made no room for mercy, only for those who could wield the throne by any means. Cromwell, in his ruthless stratagem, turned her into a sacrificial pawn in the merciless game of power where sentiment had no place. Continuing the intense political drama of the trial, on the morning of May 15, by Saint-Chaleur, Queen Anne Boleyn stepped into the courtroom deep within the Tower of London, where everything had already been orchestrated, rows of judges' seats, the assembled courtiers, and the royal soldiers had been pre-assigned their places to witness the trial of the woman who had compelled the king to divorce Catherine of Aragon and had ushered in the Church of England. Their faces were cold and devoid of mercy, the very people who would decide her fate. The atmosphere was so stifling that at times one could hear only the measured breathing of the armoured guards, mingled with the lingering scent of burning candles. When the death sentence was pronounced, there was not a single word about its execution. Under the strict laws of England at the time, a queen convicted of peculiar crimes, such as adultery or treason, should have been burned alive as a heretic. But Henry VIII, acting as supreme judge, magnanimously commuted her punishment to beheading by sword. According to the royal proclamation, this French method was more refined, swifter, and less painful than the crude English axe. That declaration of mercy rang out like a grand oration designed to fool the public into believing that the king still harboured some pity for his former wife. In reality, the sword from Calais had been shipped secretly to England even before the trial began. A few days earlier, professional French swordsmiths had quietly made their way to London with a large wooden crate, which was then concealed in the Tower's armoury. That covert arrival could not have been a coincidence. It proved that Anne's death sentence had been preordained, and the supposed leniency was merely a political charade. Cromwell and the king had meticulously planned every detail, poisoning public opinion, isolating the queen during her trial, then showcasing compassion by selecting the method of execution. Every aspect from the venue of the proceedings to the instrument of death was under their control. Any humanitarianism on Henry's part served only to manage how his wife's life would end. He did not wish her to burn in flame too horrifying and liable to stir sympathy among his subjects. A single swift sword stroke would shock the public less and preserve the dignity of the crown. Even in guilt, she shall be treated as royalty. That is why he chose the sword, to uphold the throne's honour and maintain the appearance of legitimate authority. When the trial concluded, Anne was led away in silence, uttering not a final word. Cromwell, the powerful magistrate, watched her every step with a cold satisfaction that his scheme had succeeded. Henry stood on the banks of the Thames, listening for the cannon's signal that the sentence had been carried out, his eyes not shedding a tear, his face hard with political resolve. Whispers among the onlookers praised their luck that she avoided burning, but few realized that even the sword's blow had been rehearsed in advance to guarantee no mishaps. Perhaps that rehearsal was the truest pardon the king granted her. An execution of a queen by sword was unparalleled in English history. No sovereign had ever faced such an end. Yet in the hands of Cromwell, the man who held life and death over the realm, and a king willing to sacrifice personal feelings for political ends, every moral boundary was erased. The difference between an ordinary criminal trial and the spectacle of a queen's judgment lay in politics and power. There, the law was but facade, and scheming and authority were the only realities. Later, historians still refer to the Cambridge Chronicle, the sole surviving news sheet from that moment, with its brief account. Queen Anne Boleyn met her fate calmly, without a cry for mercy. The sword from Calais fell, closing the chapter of a woman who once reshaped a kingdom. They emphasized the suddenness and cruelty of the decision, noting that even the king's mercy was nothing more than a political maneuver, not an act of genuine compassion. Yet what haunts posterity most is not the swift flash of the blade, but the calculated coldness behind it. This verdict stands as proof that in the Tudor court, personal sentiment must yield to iron-fisted power. Cromwell, by his plots and stratagems, demonstrated that only those who command the rules survive. And Henry, under the guise of mercy, preserved royal dignity at the cost of his own reputation for humanity. In the years that followed, when Princess Elizabeth Anne's only daughter ascended the throne, she had a simple plaque engraved over her mother's resting place. Here lies Anne Boleyn, holy, brave, with a heart aflame for liberty and justice. That marker testified that, though she was forced to the block by a supposedly merciful sword, her spirit lived on in the nation's memory. The image of that refined French blade could not sever the indomitable legacy she left behind. The echo of the sword's fall on that, early on the morning of May 19, Iten by Saint-Chelou, Lady Anne Boleyn awoke in her modest cell within the Tower of London. The small chamber was dimly lit by the weak glow of a single candle, its flame dancing on the damp walls. Kneeling before a simple wooden altar, she received her final Holy Communion, imploring God's mercy, and cleansing her soul. Each whispered prayer seemed to echo through the cold stone chamber, carrying away her fears and steadying her heart for the hour ahead. After the sacrament, Anne rose and donned her execution attire, a plain grey gown, symbolizing mourning and resignation, layered over a scarlet kirtle that represented faith and sacrifice. She arranged her dark hair under a small white cap, then gripped the wooden rosary beads she had carried throughout her imprisonment. Each bead was a prayer, each knot a testament to her unwavering trust in divine judgment. As she stepped out into the corridor, the clatter of armour and hushed voices of guards fell silent. Word had spread that the Queen would make her final approach to the scaffold, and the corridors were lined with stern-faced soldiers who had received explicit orders not to speak. Every footstep, every soft rustle of fabric, seemed magnified in the hush of the morning air. When Anne emerged onto the raised platform in the tower's courtyard, the assembled crowd fell into oppressive stillness. Among them were courtiers, bureaucrats, and common spectators, each summoned to bear witness to the extraordinary spectacle of a queen's execution. Anne paused at the edge of the platform, her posture regal and unbowed, her chin lifted so that she looked every person before her in the eye. Then, in a clear, unwavering voice, she addressed the silent throng. "I am not here to accuse any man or woman. I merely ask that you pray for my soul. If you plot, no plea for mercy, no outburst of anger, only this quiet declaration of faith and dignity." For an instant, time seemed to stand still, as if the very stones of the tower paused to honour the gravity of her words. Moments later, the French executioner's sword, a slender, gleaming blade imported in secret from Calais, was brought forward, and the Queen's head was gently guided onto the block. A single signal was given, and the blade fell. Gasps rippled through the spectators as Anne's head separated from her body. Witnesses would later recall seeing her lips move ever so slightly, as if completing the final prayer of her heart. 3 of her most loyal ladies-waiting knelt beside the block, their faces hidden by their veils. With reverent care, they gathered the Queen's body, wrapped it in coarse cloth, and laid it within a wooden chest marked Henry VIII's Ordnance Store. This hasty, unceremonious burial was to be temporary, a pragmatic measure, until official funeral rites could be arranged. King Henry VIII was not among those who watched from the courtyard. Instead, he lingered on the riverbank, awaiting the thunderous report of the tower's great guns, the agreed-upon signal that Anne's life had ended. As the echoing blast rang out, he closed his eyes and offered no visible sign of grief. He had already turned away from the woman who had once redefined his reign. At the very moment her life was extinguished, he boarded his gilded royal barge and set off down the Thames to meet Jane Seymour, the new Queen-in-Waiting. That swift transition, from one wife to the next, underscored his willingness to subordinate marital bonds to political necessity and personal desire. Barely 36 hours earlier, Anne had awoken beneath that same roof as a living queen. Now, she lay nameless in a chest under the tower's battlements. Such was the precipitous arc of power in Tudor England. Long before her tragic end, Anne had been born circa 1000, 500 at Blickling Hall in Norfolk, scion of an ambitious rising family. Her father, Sir Thomas Boleyn, had served as ambassador to France and the Netherlands, ensuring that his daughter received an education unfettered by the provincial limitations that constrained most English noblewomen. She spent her formative years immersed in the Renaissance courts of Europe, drinking deeply of humanist learning, mastering French and Flemish, and absorbing the subtle protocols of continental court life. These qualities marked Anne as singular among English women. She returned to England fluent in French, versed in theology and literature, and possessed of a political acumen that rivaled some of the realm's most seasoned courtiers. Where most ladies of the court dazzled with finery, Anne impressed with wit and will, an intoxicating combination that would both lift her to the apex of power and precipitate her downfall. Historian Alison Weir famously remarked, "Anne was no innocent victim of court intrigue. She wove her web with skill and lured the king into its snare." Indeed, it was Anne's determination, her refusal to accept the role of king's mistress, that ignited a 6-year odyssey to capture Henry's heart. While a mistress might enjoy momentary favour, Anne insisted on the supreme title of Queen of England. Her insistence sparked a constitutional crisis that culminated in Henry's divorce from Catherine of Aragon, his break with Rome, and the founding of the Church of England. That tempestuous ascent was fueled by Anne's ambition, intelligence, and flair for politics. At court celebrations, she read passages from Scripture to the king and spoke of reforming the church. At Privy Council meetings, she argued for the king's supremacy in ecclesiastical affairs. In public, she carried herself with an air of serene command. Every gesture, every syllable, testified to her conviction that she was not merely a consort, but a partner in governance. Yet ambition carries its own peril. By 1536, Anne's failure to deliver a male heir had eroded royal patience. It was not simply the absence of a son that imperiled her, it was the sense that she had become a liability to Henry's dynastic security. Into this breach stepped Thomas Cromwell, the king's chief minister and master strategist, who perceived that the Queen's fall could simultaneously eliminate a political rival and solidify his own power. Cromwell and Anne had once been staunch allies in the Reformation, working side by side to assert royal supremacy. But when their visions diverged, Anne championing a more radical break with tradition, Cromwell favouring cautious consolidation, their alliance disintegrated. Cromwell capitalised on Henry's waning affection, orchestrating a campaign of slander that accused Anne of adultery with multiple courtiers, and even her brother George Boleyn. These charges, though utterly baseless, flourished in a culture predisposed to suspect a powerful woman. On May 15, Etienne Wu by Saint-Chalot, Anne faced a court composed entirely of the king's appointees. Denied legal counsel and deprived of any genuine defence, she watched as those who had once pledged loyalty were executed for their alleged complicity. It was a staged performance. Cromwell scripted the trial. Henry delivered the final order, and Anne played the tragic victim. When the death sentence was announced, Cromwell and the king voiced pity that she would not be burned at the stake, a punishment reserved for heretics, but would instead be executed by a French sword. The genteel alternative. In truth, the sword had arrived from Calais days before the trial even commenced, concealed in the Tower's armoury. This stark fact revealed that Anne's fate was sealed the moment Cromwell and the king decided to act. Their public display of mercy was nothing more than a political artifice, designed to manage public reaction and maintain regal dignity. Thus, on the morning of May 19, Anne donned her grey and red, knelt for one last sacrament, walked to her final judgment with head held high, spoke her single dignified plea, and embraced death without fear. The blade fell, her head rolled, and the last vestiges of Anne Boleyn's earthly story were consigned to history. Yet her legacy endured, born Margaret's daughter, raised in Renaissance courts, crowned England's queen, and executed on a fateful scaffold. Anne Boleyn came to symbolize both the heights of female ambition and the perils of resisting patriarchal power. In later years, her daughter Elizabeth would ascend the throne and establish an era defined by moderate Protestantism, cultural flowering, and strong female leadership, a living testament to the mother who had dared defy Rome and royal convention alike. Anne's life and death remind us that in Tudor England, the intersection of personal passion, religious upheaval, and political intrigue could build dynasties or destroy them at a single royal command. Her story, written in equal measures of grandeur and tragedy, continues to captivate a world forever changed by the rise and fall of Elizabeth's mother, the indomitable Queen Anne Boleyn. With the tragic death of Anne Boleyn, many assumed that the Tudor royal line had run dry of vision and ambition. Yet history's horizon did not end in one woman's downfall. In 1558, Princess Elizabeth, daughter of Anne and King Henry VIII, ascended the throne as Queen Elizabeth I, inaugurating a golden age that would last 44 years and be known to posterity as the Elizabethan era. In her very first years of reign, Queen Elizabeth I confronted numerous crises: an empty treasury, threats from Catholic Spain and the papacy, and a deeply divided England split between Catholicism and the Reformed Church. She swiftly demonstrated her political genius by enacting the Elizabethan religious settlement of 1559, a compromise that balanced Catholic ritual with Protestant doctrine to create a moderate Church of England. This elegant formula spared England from the bloody religious wars ravaging continental Europe and secured internal stability, laying the groundwork for her ambitious plans yet to come. Next, Elizabeth turned her focus to reviving and strengthening the navy. She commissioned the construction of dozens of powerful warships and backed privateers and explorers such as Sir Francis Drake and Sir John Hawkins. In 1588, when the mighty Spanish Armada, the most formidable fleet in Europe, sailed to invade England, Elizabeth famously stood upon the deck of her flagship, brandishing a sword and rallying her troops. "I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king." Thanks to nimble tactics and a timely storm, the English fleet shattered the Armada, safeguarding the nation's honour and establishing England's future as a preeminent seafaring power. On the diplomatic front, Elizabeth skillfully maintained friendly ties with France, eased tensions with Scotland, and championed the founding of chartered trading companies such as the East India Company in 1600, opening trade routes to India and the Far East. England's economy flourished. Wool, silk, and exotic spices flowed through the port of London. Merchants prospered, and public markets bustled with merchants from across Europe. Culturally, the Elizabethan age was a golden era for English literature and theatre. Elizabeth herself patronized poets and musicians like Edmund Spenser and John Donne, and perhaps most famously, playwrights William Shakespeare and Christopher Marlowe. Grand histories, tragic dramas, and passionate sonnets enriched the national language. Theatres such as the Globe and Blackfriars thrived, bringing performance art to audiences of all classes and cementing England's reputation for creative excellence. Beyond politics and the arts, Elizabeth I exemplified the ideal of a powerful woman in her own right. She styled herself the Virgin Queen and married England rather than a foreign prince. Refusing marriage proposals from emperors and kings across the continent, her perpetual single status freed her from foreign entanglements and projected the image of a sovereign wholly dedicated to her realm. Unter her Reign, noble women conquered new opportunities for education and estate management, paving the way for the gradual emergence of women's rights. The Elizabethan period also witnessed significant scientific advancement. Astronomer John Dee, mathematician Thomas Harriot, and numerous other scholars received royal favour. Oceanic voyages returned not only wealth, but also new knowledge of geography and natural history. Englishmen began to pride themselves as world explorers, sowing the seeds of the Enlightenment that would follow. Popular culture blossomed in turn, with madrigals and public poetry, the first printed periodicals in London, and lavish public festivals featuring masquerades, poetry recitals, and courtly dances. This exuberance extended to architecture. New or renovated royal residences like Greenwich Palace and Hampton Court displayed the distinctive Elizabethan style, combining white stone, red brick, and intricately carved timber framing. Although Elizabeth's reign was not without challenges, succession anxieties owing to her childlessness, assassination plots by extremist Catholics, and signs of decline toward its end, it remains an era that inspired future generations. Queen Elizabeth I closed the book on more than 3 centuries of civil strife and religious conflict, and opened the chapter on England's rise as a maritime empire with colonies in the Americas, Asia, and Africa. Anne Boleyn's true legacy, channeled through her daughter Elizabeth, was not merely a flourishing dynasty but a testament to the ideals of liberty and equality. Elizabeth I ruled as an independent queen, embodying the spirit her mother had sown, that women could lead with skill and command life and death without relying on patriarchal structures. As that golden age came to its conclusion, posterity continued to honour the Virgin Queen with reverence. When night fell over the Thames, and the wind sighed through the battlements of the Tower of London, it seemed to carry the echo of Anne Boleyn's proud, unbowed prayer, an affirmation that the soul of a queen who never yielded would forever breathe within England, where her remarkable daughter had carried on her mother's vision and inscribed her name on the pages of history. Even though Queen Elizabeth I was celebrated as the Virgin Queen for her extraordinary political acumen, flawless diplomatic vision, and indomitable spirit, she also harboured personal habits and flaws that modern historians have not hesitated to explore. One of the oldest scandals attached to her name concerns her personal hygiene. It was widely believed that Elizabeth bathed only once a quarter, and that she feared water to the point of refusing to wash her entire body. But what is the truth behind this story? And how did it affect her health and public image in the eyes of courtiers and commoners alike? First, one must recognize that 16th century bathing customs differed markedly from our own. In Tudor society, it was thought that water opened the pores and allowed harmful humours to enter the body, causing illness. Many nobles, both men and women, limited themselves to washing their faces, necks, armpits, and feet with a damp cloth scented with perfume, rather than submerging themselves in a bath. As for Elizabeth, later diaries and the memoirs of her attendants reveal that she particularly detested the damp odour and generally avoided prolonged soaks. Even the royal physicians, who recommended occasional warm, herb-infused baths to soothe her nerves, found that the Queen seldom complied. This aversion forced the court and its visitors to endure a constant cloud of potent fragrances, as Elizabeth compensated by dabbing concentrated oils, rose essence from Dalat, East Indian patchouli, or fresh peppermint oil on her wrists and the hems of her gowns. The legend that Elizabeth bathed only once per quarter likely stems from a notation by a court physician, who recorded, "The Queen permits her bathmaid to wash her but once each season." Yet, careful scholarship has uncovered other records suggesting that Elizabeth may have bathed twice each summer, roughly 6 times a year, rather than the 4 times rumoured. Even so, that frequency remains far below any modern standard. Her infrequent bathing made her even more dependent on high-quality perfumes, leading to embassies and dining halls, Whitehall, Hampton Court, and non-such palace alike, being suffused with such heady scents that some guests complained of nearly choking on the perfume haze. Beyond hygiene, Elizabeth was notorious for eccentric eating habits. She delighted in sweet confections, almond meal pastries, marzipan, hard candies, and mead puddings. No royal feast under her name was complete without tiered cakes frosted in sugar and candied cherries. Late in life, some accounts suggest she suffered from what we would now recognize as diabetes, accompanied by obesity and edema that forced her into voluminous gowns. Some court physicians joked half in jest, half in truth that, "I cannot believe a woman could rule without cake in her stomach." Though humorous, the remark underscored her rather indulgent, if not entirely moderate, diet mentally. Elizabeth displayed a marked paranoia about betrayal. Despite having successfully uncovered and crushed numerous assassination plots, she remained deeply suspicious of her closest courtiers and frequently replaced her private secretaries. This habit intensified in the 1592, when she faced extremist Catholic conspiracies, some linking Bishop Bancroft to the gunpowder plot, and became increasingly ruthless. Court letters record her swift dismissal or imprisonment of any official lacking loyalty, sometimes for a poorly chosen remark or misplaced jest. Elizabeth's prickliness extended to foreign envoys as well. When the Spanish ambassador Luis de Carvajal first visited Whitehall, he described the Queen offering a brittle smile before abruptly turning away, leaving her retinue in awkward confusion. On another occasion, when Emperor Matthias of the Holy Roman Empire sent Christmas gifts, Elizabeth refused any item made from fur, claiming a skin allergy. These minor incidents reveal that, alongside her diplomatic finesse, she could struggle with the subtleties of courtly hospitality. Moreover, Elizabeth I was obsessed with her wardrobe. She amassed thousands of gowns and cloaks embroidered with pearls, gilt, and fine satin in every colour imaginable. On each provincial progress, she might change costumes dozens of times, forcing her equerries and servants into a frenzy of preparation. This extravagance strained the royal coffers and earned her a reputation among the hungry and impoverished as the lavish queen. Repeated pleas for frugality and financial restraint were often overshadowed by the court's prodigious spending on fashion alone. On a personal level, Elizabeth's decision never to marry the hallmark of the Virgin Queen guaranteed her absolute power, but also imposed a solitude and emotional stalemate. Psychological historians suggest she developed a deep envy toward any woman who drew too close to the king's circle, especially high-ranking noblewomen entrusted to attend her. Such jealousy could result in harsh disciplinary measures against anyone deemed to have invaded her personal space, even if the offence was nothing more than too familiar conversation. In sum, Queen Elizabeth I, icon of a glorious age, possessed very human weaknesses: poor bathing habits, excessive suspicion, imprudent diet, stupendous wardrobe expenditures, and a loneliness born of her vow of chastity. Far from detracting from her historical significance, these facets enrich our understanding of a complex individual, both great and deeply human. Elizabeth I stands as proof that the most outstanding leaders also carry their own failings, and that it is precisely these shadows that complete the portrait of a person. With all the strength and sensitivity that history demands, Tudor society in the 16th century was notoriously harsh and unjust toward women. Their worth was judged primarily by lineage and reproductive capability. Against that backdrop, Anne Boleyn emerged like a brilliant yet thorny star. She was not merely a beauty who captivated the king, but a sharp political mind. Through her intellect and ambition, Anne shattered the old barriers and asserted her individual status in a world that accepted women only as ornamental vases. From the moment she entered the Tudor court, Anne demonstrated exceptional political acumen. She skillfully leveraged relationships with senior officials and the Reformation faction, while maintaining close ties with humanist scholars. By translating and exchanging letters with French and Dutch intellectuals, she introduced progressive ideas about human rights and the status of women into England. Anne's diplomatic talent made her more than the king's plaything. She became a true stateswoman, capable of influencing both domestic and foreign policy. Naturally, this newfound power clashed with the court's conservative faction. Accustomed to a feudal tradition in which women had no say in critical decisions, when Anne repeatedly proposed church reforms, urged the monarch's supremacy over the Pope, and encouraged the establishment of the Church of England. The traditionalists felt their opaque interests threatened. They concentrated their efforts on smearing her reputation with rumours of adultery and corruption, determined to eliminate this dangerous rival from the political game. Despite her efforts to defend her rights with talent and influence, Anne Boleyn ultimately succumbed to the conspiratorial machinery and court pressure. Yet her defeat did nothing to dim her historical stature. Anne became the first woman in English history to compel a king to divorce his reigning queen, a precedent unparalleled in the Catholic Church, and to stand up to the Pope's supreme authority. Her acceptance of the role that precipitated Henry VIII's annulment proved that a woman could instigate a supreme shift in power. Anne's impact did not stop there. She served as the catalyst for the English Reformation. She actively supported the enactment of the 1534 Act of Supremacy, which granted the king the title Supreme Head of the Church of England, severing ties with papal rule. This religious severance not only affirmed national sovereignty, but also paved the way for later movements advocating religious freedom. Though Anne never lived to witness its fruits, her legacy provided the foundation for future generations' pursuit of spiritual liberty. In terms of women's rights, Anne Boleyn left an indelible mark. She proved that women could wield power equal to men through her modern education, diplomatic skill, and strategic vision. She shattered the prejudice that women could only serve as companions or instruments for preserving lineage. Images of Anne standing alongside the king, addressing the Privy Council, or presiding over policy discussions, instead of quietly occupying a banquet seat, inspired aristocratic and scholarly women of subsequent eras. Although Anne did not live to see the results, her daughter Elizabeth I inherited and expanded that legacy. Elizabeth ruled with wisdom and success, ushering in the glorious Elizabethan age. She deftly balanced religious factions, strengthened the navy, promoted global commerce, and fostered a cultural renaissance. Every achievement from the initial Reformation to maritime triumph bore the imprint of Anne Boleyn's pioneering spirit. Anne's story reminds us of two inseparable truths: the power of ambition and the price paid for challenging the status quo. She courageously risked everything to break tradition, and in doing so suffered the tragic fate reserved for those who dare to dream big. From Anne's life, we draw lessons in meticulous preparation, understanding the rules and anticipating resistance, and in the bravery to face extreme risks for the sake of freedom and authority, even at the cost of her life. Her yearning for liberty remains a guiding flame for future generations. When the autumn wind sweeps past the Tower of London, where once Anne's footsteps echoed toward the scaffold, one almost hears again her proud, unbowed prayer. Her legacy lives on not merely in the pages of history, but in the enduring spirit of perseverance and boundless aspiration dwelling in the hearts of all who cherish freedom and justice. More than 4 centuries have passed since the sword severed Queen Anne Boleyn's steps upon the icy scaffold at the Tower of London. Yet her spirit still echoes in every chill wind that slips through the stone cracks. Under the pale moonlight, the vision of her, this woman who dared to challenge authority, still stands tall as an emblem of defiance, chin lifted, lips curving in a confident smile, eyes blazing as they met her fate, head on. That image is not merely a memory of a historical moment, but truly a manifesto for every woman who dares to rise and confront oppressive power. Her final prayer, "I am not come hither to accuse any person. I only desire that you will pray for my soul," has become an everlasting refrain, like a lighthouse guiding courageous hearts. Even in the life or death instant when the sword fell and darkness seemed to swallow the world, Anne preserved her dignity and her faith. It is proof of an inner strength that transcends fear, of a love and hope that shines bright, no matter how fierce the storm beyond the scaffold. Anne Boleyn's legacy does not end with the story of Queen Elizabeth I or the later prosperity of the Elizabethan age. Indeed, her most enduring impact lies in how she transformed personal suffering and tragedy into a source of widespread inspiration. Though the fallen queen was buried beneath the dust of scandal, her story was never lost. It burned more brightly with each page of history and each whispered retelling, from the palaces of Siam to the castles of Europe. Anne's image kneeling to pray before the sword became a beacon for countless generations, showing that even the smallest individual can awaken an entire realm. In the rigid Tudor society, where women were often regarded as mere vessels for lineage and reputation, Anne Boleyn dared to shatter every outdated mould. She refused the roles of parlour ornament or courtly consort, insisting instead on her place as a genuine stateswoman. Her subtle diplomacy, keen political vision, and persuasive eloquence placed her at the heart of power, unnerving the conservatives and provoking their relentless efforts to destroy her. Although Anne fought with all her talent and influence to protect her position, she ultimately succumbed to the conspiratorial machinery and courtly pressure, yet her defeat did nothing to diminish her historical stature. Anne was the first woman in English history to compel a king to divorce his current queen, a move without precedent in the Catholic Church, and to confront the Pope's supreme authority. By agreeing to be the cause of Henry VIII's annulment, she proved that a woman could initiate a supreme shift in power. Anne's story reminds us of two inseparable truths: the force of ambition and the price demanded when one challenges the established order. From her life, we learn lessons of courage, méticuleux préparation, and the costs of freedom, even at the expense of her life. Her fervent yearning for liberty remains a guiding flame for future generations. When the autumn wind sighs through the Tower of London, the spot where Anne's footsteps once echoed toward the scaffold, one can almost hear her proud, unbowed prayer. Her legacy lies not only on the pages of history, but in the steadfast spirit and limitless aspiration that live on in the hearts of all who cherish freedom and justice. And so we have concluded the tragic tale of Anne Boleyn's final day, the most shocking execution in British history. A journey taking us from the glory days of a young, ambitious queen to the staged trial and the merciless stroke of the sword at the Tower of London. Anne Boleyn, the woman who drove King Henry VIII to break with the Roman Church in order to make her his queen, was charged with adultery and treason without any convincing evidence. Her trial on May 15, Etienne by Saint-Chelou, was merely a theatrical display of power in which Thomas Cromwell and the king had the sword from Calais ready in advance, turning their mercy of a swift beheading by sword into the cold, final blow of an unrelenting regime. At dawn on May 19, Anne awoke for the last time in the stifling room of the Tower of London, took her final Holy Communion seeking peace of mind, and donned her simple grey gown with the crimson kirtle beneath. On her way to the scaffold, she held her head high, Gavia Serin Ismail, and offered the silent crowd her last words: "I am not come here to accuse any person. I only desire that you will pray for my soul." The stroke fell swiftly but left an indelible mark for all time. Her head rolled, her lips still moved in prayer, and 3 loyal ladies-in-waiting quietly gathered her body, wrapped it in coarse cloth, and laid it in a wooden chest. Anne Boleyn's death was not the end of her legacy, but the beginning of a new chapter in English history. Her daughter, Elizabeth IV, ascended the throne in 1558, inaugurating a 44-year golden age, known to posterity as the Elizabethan era. Under Elizabeth's reign, England achieved religious stability through the Elizabethan religious settlement, defeated the Spanish Armada, built a formidable navy, saw a cultural flowering with Shakespeare and Spencer, and expanded global trade via chartered companies. All of these achievements trace back to the perilous first steps of Anne Boleyn, the woman who laid the groundwork for religious self-determination and women's place at the center of power. Looking back, Anne's story testifies to the power of ambition and intellect, and serves as a warning of the price paid when challenging entrenched authority. She shattered archaic rules and proved that women could match men in vision and leadership, an immortal declaration of personal freedom. And that is why Anne Boleyn's final day stands as one of the most searing judgments in English history, etched into collective memory for centuries. Thank you for watching all the way through. Sleep well. And don't forget to hit subscribe so you won't miss our newest and greatest videos.